I think this second part is a very nice opportunity that we have just to make the link between this quality evaluation of the harvest that we saw in that previous presentation and practically what can we do in terms of winemaking in the cellar to compensate some of these characteristics that we are seeing. So just from maybe from previous presentations, you have heard a few concepts like grape profile, wine profile. So I'm just going to go a little deeper into that and what do we call wine profile. In this sense, we call the wine profile the target wine that we want to make. Normally, it's where you want to go with the wines and what are you trying to achieve in terms of concentration, aroma intensity, oak profile, etc., etc. So keeping in mind that the wine profile is where we want to go, the grape profile, it's our starting point. The way we evaluate quality of the harvest and we are able to say, okay, in these blocks, we're going to achieve a certain quality. This is going to be my A grapes, B or C. Every action that we make inside of the cellar is going to have an impact on the final result. And it's important that we keep in mind because there's a lot of times that we keep, just because of lack of labor, lack of time, a lot of logistic problems that we have inside of the winery, we're not able to adapt our winemaking. So kind of like the proposal and the methodology that I'm going to be presenting right now is a way to think ahead of time how we can be flexible with our winemaking process in every stage, from aging, fermentation, extraction, even harvest. For this, I'm again presenting a methodology that I'm just sharing with you a part of the research and development that we have done internally as a company. But we're taking every step of the process and we're analyzing which key parameters have a bigger impact on the final results. So this is just an example on aging, but we know that oxygen and temperature are going to be factors that we really need to control and that they're going to have the largest impact at the end on the wine that we're making. To simplify the complexity of the universe of styles that we have created what we call a wine matrix or a wine style map. Here we have made categories that are divided by the level of ripeness at the moment of picking. I don't know if you can see, it's kind of small, but we have aromatic families that help us classify the type of aromas we're finding in the wines. And we also have classified this according to how they react to certain parameters like oxygen, lees, oak, etc. So on the X-axis, we have the level of ripeness, and on the Y, we have the level of concentration. This is very much connected with picking point, like we said before, and the way you treat the wines in fermentation, and especially in fermentation, but also in aging. And for these 6 styles that we have a classification that is called for varietal aromas, fresh, concentrated. On the upper left, we have what we normally call neutral or non-varietal aromas. This is when you don't get these thiols or terpenes. And then we have a riper window. And the level of concentration changes according to the potential of the grapes. So by simplifying where we can position the wines, we can, again, adapt our winemaking and know how every decision that we make is going to impact the final results. For example, during alcoholic fermentation, we know that extraction, so polyphenolic extraction, and oxygen management are going to be key. And these wine styles are going to change and they're going to have different requirements. For example, in some of them, the ones that we picked earlier, we're going to have to be careful not to extract too many veggie notes. In the ones that we are waiting and we have overripe notes and dry tannins, we're going to need to be careful about not extracting all these dry tannins and actually end up drying up the wine even more. And the same is with oxygen. The level of ripeness of at the picking point indicates and gives us an idea of how much oxygen that wine will able to incorporate and we're going to be able to work with. When we're talking about oxygen, I always need to remember that the sooner the treatment with oxygen, the better results we're going to get. So every treatment that we do with oxygen should be done before the end of malolactic fermentation. After that, the impact is going to be way less, and the results that we're going to get, they're not going to be shown in the same way. In terms of oxygen, again, the level of ripeness has a big impact on how much oxygen we're going to be able to use. I'm not going to go into the amounts, but we have a suggestion based on years and years of R&D. You're going to have these slides, and you're going to see the numbers. But this is very much connected to ripeness and the timing. Again, has to be done before malolactic fermentation. If not, the impact is very, very different. In terms of oak input, we can do the same. By knowing the type of wine that we have, we can assume that certain styles of oak are going to have a different impact on the final results. And for example, if we need to fight some veggie notes, we know that vanilla compounds are great compounds to mask pyrrazines, for example. Then adjusting the dose is a matter of styles and winemaking, but in general terms, you can have an idea of which oak profile is going to favor more your final results. When we are in this neutral, non-varietal type of window, we know that any style is just going to be an extra help. And we're going to see later we can generate some aromas during fermentation. Finally, for something that is going into the ripe or overripe, we have defined with our R&D that certain smoky, toasty profiles can help give the idea of a refreshment instead of always playing with the doses, but it can help us refresh the wine. So again, adapting to the type of initial grapes that we're having, how we treat these wines inside of the cellar. When we're talking about polyphenolic extraction, this is just some results from an experiment conducted in 2012. We came up with the conclusion that, of course, temperature and time of extraction has a huge impact on the final results of the wine. And while we, by increasing temperature, will increase the extraction of tannins, we won't increase that much the extraction of color. So we have to be really careful here, because when we apply fixed protocols, we may be extracting in these overripe type of profiles, we may be extracting negative components that we need to avoid instead. So trying to maintain a ratio, a healthy ratio between tannins and anthocyanins, it's an important part of the management of the extraction. In terms of oxygen, also a quick reminder, we have two ways of adding oxygen to our wines. A punctual addition of macrooxygenation with a big amount added in a short period of time, or a continuous small addition that is normally added in a longer time. It can be weeks, it can be months. Oxygen can be added during fermentation, and here we have two ways of seeing it. One is for the yeast, and the second one is for the wine. And this is what I think is super interesting, because it gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of what we can do, the type of doses that we can apply, and the results that we're going to get. During alcoholic fermentation, the yeast actually needs oxygen at one point and one point only. This population that is going from exponential to stationary, when they're changing this rate of multiplication, is exactly when they need the oxygen. If we're able to apply a pulse of oxygen around between 5 and 10 milligrams per liter, we are able to strengthen that population. That population is going to build their wall, and it's going to have sterols that are going to help them resist the end of fermentation and the toxicity of the alcohol. And we're going to have a population that is healthier for a longer time. So by this, we can reduce the time of fermentation almost by 30%, depends on the situation. So again, securization of alcoholic fermentation is a key parameter, especially for these lots that we saw earlier in the presentation, that they struggled, that we really had to wait until they had the concentration, because they didn't have probably the aromatics that we normally are expecting. So we have a higher risk for stock fermentation. In that case, oxygen in a punctual addition can be a very important technique to apply to prevent stock fermentations. Again, oxygen as a micro-oxygenation during the fermentation can be another tool to stabilize color. And again, when we have these weak lots that they don't smell, and they don't have the intensity of aromas, they lack concentration, they normally are connected to a lower color or coloring stability. If we're able to apply oxygen during fermentation, we're going to see that the results are gonna change drastically. And normally, total doses of addition between 10 milligrams per liter total can really change this. It's the same for aging. When we apply before malolactic fermentation, we are going to bring the wines into a higher color intensity. And again, in the graphic, we're just showing like a low addition versus a high addition, but in general, what we will see is that when we stop the micro-ox or when we stop the oxygenation, the color will drop like it normally will do with the control, but at least we will have gained a few extra steps of color. So keep that in mind. For color stability, another one of the tools. But oxygen is not only for color stability and not only for the yeast. We can really change profiles. And by applying the right rate to the right grape profile, to the right base of juice, we know that we can completely change a wine and get rid of all these veggie notes, bring it into a riper profile, and increase structure and viscosity on a wine. So we can really play with palate and aroma components. So going into what we saw this harvest, we would place, and I'm just going to talk, I'm not going to talk about the great blocks, the good ones, the good quality. You know what to do with that. I'm just going to see the blocks that struggle to get into a minimum amount of sugar load that normally will have all these aromatic windows that we saw, the fresh, the neutral, the ripe, but normally they have less concentration. So we still need to work with them. And the proposal that we're doing is that you can adapt the process. You have tools that need to be applied in order to be flexible and not apply the same protocol, the same recipe to everything. So in this year, what we saw for these medium potential blocks, medium to low potential blocks, is that there are quite some few priority points to evaluate. The color extraction and stabilization. We have the extraction of fruit aromas, and also the creation of aromas, because I always see your faces when I say neutral window, and it's like, what is neutral? Neutral is actually the lack of varietal aromas. It's the lack of thiols, it's the lack of terpenes, it's the lack of precursors. In that case, when we have that type of profile and we're harvesting at that time, because we cannot harvest everything at their optimal point, we know that we can create aromas in the winery. We can create it through fermentation, through the yeast. So I'm gonna show you something connected to that, but some of the other points that we are evaluating is the decrease of veggie notes, some of the goals that we will have, in the case that we had to pick early, and in the case that we had to wait and we are entering these overripe windows, it's how we can avoid the extraction of dry tannins to dry even more the wines. And finally, the last priority point is the increase of viscosity, which I think it's always a request for winemakers, like how can I make my wines more, bring them into a more fat profile instead of probably adding more products. Because again, there's a lot of products that are amazing and you can apply. The idea now is just to talk about technology. So my main focus now is going to be on the polyphenolic extraction management and the oxygen addition. So how we can extract the good without extracting the bad? We have quite some few techniques around. For extraction on color and fruit, we have pre-fermentative cold soaking that we can do. There's SO2 soaking. Here we have to be careful with the green matrix when we're picking something that is more on the green side, because we have a risk of extracting veggie notes, and we need to be careful with that. For the elimination of these veggie characters, we know that heat treatments at high temperature are really helpful. Not all wineries, they have this technology. You need to have a big equipment and big investment, but still it's good to remember that this is a great tool. When you're using it, it's important also to remember to combine it with oxygen, because all this color and fruit extraction are very unstable. So oxygen can be a wonderful tool to combine with that and stabilize the profiles. And finally, to increase mid palate, we know that extended maceration at a high temperature or a delestage at a high temperature can also help break the walls of cells, extract polysaccharides, work on the sweetness, work on the viscosity, but always keeping in mind that we need to be careful not to extract dry tannins when we have them. So when I was mentioning before, what can we do to create aromas? I'm talking about managing turbidity and temperature during fermentation. If we are able to provide for the yeast with the right conditions, the yeast can create a lot of esters that are gonna be aromas of fruit and flowers that can be the closest we're gonna get to a varietal aroma in that situation. So again, you have techniques. I'm not gonna go deep into that, but later on we can talk if you have any questions. We know that we can really, really manage the profile just by adjusting certain parameters during fermentation. So for this year, again, we're talking about this situation where the potential wasn't great. We're talking about these medium potential, low potential blocks that we have 3 case scenarios. One of them, we had to harvest early just because of logistics. You need to start getting grapes inside of the cellar. In this case, our main goal is going to be to try to avoid these veggie notes and also increase structure and mid palate, because normally they tend to be weaker wines. So in that case, for extraction, we are suggesting to use heat treatments, of course, when it's possible. And always remembering that this color and this color extraction, it's kind of unstable and it needs to be supplemented with oxygen. In terms of oak management, like I mentioned before, when we're harvesting something in the greener side, vanilla notes for oak are amazing tools to mask veggie notes, to mask pyracins, so they can be used here together with other structuring types of oak and oak that can bring the viscosity a little up. In the case that we're moving into a riper window, again, maybe we will have more aromas. We will have a little more color, but we are still going to be on the weaker side of the palate. So increasing viscosity is going to be one of our main goals. Here, in terms of extraction, we can always use heat treatments, again, like we said before. Or we can use a cold soaking to extract aromas, extract color, because here we don't have the risk of extracting dry tannins. So we have a little more options that we will do in some other situations to extract this fruit and color that we're looking. Oxygen, again, we know that when we move into a riper profile, the oxygen reactivity, the reactivity to oxygen, is gonna drop. So we're gonna have to adjust the way we add oxygen, but it's, again, super complementary and it's gonna stabilize the potential that you have on the grapes. For oak management, any type of oak that can increase viscosity, sweetness is gonna be a big help. And in terms of profile, I think here it's just really up to your winemaking style. Normally we suggest to use more toasty profiles just to bring the fruit up. And finally, I think case 3 is one of the most common, or the ones that I saw this harvest as one of the most commons, because we need to wait sometimes for the aromas to reveal. We are waiting for the sweetness. We're waiting for something, especially in these blocks that we saw initially, that they don't have the level of concentration that we are normally getting, so we're waiting and waiting and waiting. In that case, the real challenge for these wines is try to avoid the extraction of dry tannins, because we already have a matrix of tannins that is very important, and if our actions during fermentation help us extract more, we have a high risk of drying up the wine. So in this case, again, we can use some cold soaking. We can use practice that is used in Burgundy a lot, that is the delestage at high temperature. Always, again, keeping in mind that we need to press it right away because we do have a risk of extracting dry tannins. So any maceration that we do here, it has to be a little shorter just to prevent that extraction. Oxygen here is going to be key to stabilize color because these matrix, they tend to be less stable in terms of color. And even if we have a nice color initially, at the end of fermentation, we're going to see that the color intensity is going to drop a lot. So oxygen, again, as a tool to play with the technology you may have in your cellars to stabilize it. And finally, for oak, again, we're talking about any type of oak that you can use that increases mid-palate, that sweetness you're going to have probably, and this, remembering always this refreshing side that this smoky, spicy type of oak sometimes they have. So always depending on the dose, if we add a higher dose, we know that we're going to cover the fruit, but instead, if we play really well our doses, we can refresh the wines. Just going to show you a practical experiment, a practical result that we got this year. This is a winery that had a super overripe Cabernet Sauvignon. They harvested 32 bricks, I think. It was really hard. And we didn't play with the extraction, but we did play with the oxygen. And we applied, you can see here, yeah, you can see that those big dots. And that's the detection of the Vmax, and that's the application of the big pulse of oxygen. So that oxygenation really helped the yeast thrive through a very difficult wine because it had to ferment 32 bricks. And at the end, we did an addition of oxygen in between that got rid of all the veggie notes, lift the fruit, lift the volume, and at the end, we had a completely different wine than the control. So as a conclusion, we have a lot of techniques, we have a lot of technology that can help us adapt. We just need to be precise about the grape profile evaluation that we do initially and try to adapt the process to that grape profile and finally execute the programs. This will help us to get the wines that we need at the end. So thank you. And I don't know if we have time for questions or no?
At lunch, yeah.
Yeah, at lunch. Yeah, okay.